Is retirement only for the wealthy now? Because it's starting to feel that way. I mean, Gen Xers, are we kidding ourselves that we're ever going to be able to afford retirement? I know you've seen the headlines regarding the cost of living, and soon some of us Gen Xers will be facing retirement, whether by choice or not. And when that happens, those cost of living raises that we get at our jobs, those will be history. So I have to ask, and I think you should too, can we really afford to retire? Is retirement becoming extinct for many people? I've got 4 points I want to cover in today's video, so let's go. Now, first thing I want to talk about is how inflation changes the math. And of course, it's been true, always been true. But let's take 2022, for example. In our recent memory, inflation reached such a high point, higher than it had been since the early 80s when we were kids. When we first started saving for our retirements, some of us started sooner than others, but did we ever imagine that today housing, health care, insurance, that these things would be as expensive as they are today? Now here's the key question that you have to ask yourself. Does your retirement plan account for inflation? Because really the only way to protect yourself against it is to invest in things that can outpace it. And that limits your options. Now when you're calculating out your retirement projections in your planning stages, I wouldn't use anything less than 3.5% to be safe. And we know it can go much higher than that. And remember, retirement isn't a one and done event. It's not about just getting to that first day of retirement. We've got to protect our nest egg for 20, 30 plus years after that retirement starts. And number 2 on the list is healthcare. We can't ignore it. A lot of us are thinking, I'll just hold out for Medicare. At least I'll be able to afford that and it'll cover most everything. But as Gen Xers, we could face a lot of health issues before our 65th birthday. And even once you're on Medicare, it's not free and it doesn't cover everything. And you'll likely need a separate prescription drug plan, possibly a Medigap plan, which all cost extra. Fidelity, they do this study every year, and they estimate that a couple today retiring at 65 will need around $315,000 to spend on health care during a 30-year retirement. Now, ideally, we'll avoid needing health care or long-term care as long as possible. The third point I wanted to discuss is housing. So let's think about the future. Do you have a plan for where you'll live for the next few decades? And will that house age well with you, or will it fight you as you get older? What if your kids need to move back in with you, or you need to move your parents in with you to take care of them? Is that doable? You have to think about these things. Now, if you're counting on inheriting your parents' home, just know that if one or both of your parents, they have to go into long-term care, they have to go into a nursing home, and once all of their savings are exhausted and Medicaid has to kick in, they can and will put a lien on that house to pay for their care. But there are other big housing decisions to think about. Downsizing, possibly relocating, renovating that house, insuring the house through the decades, and protecting yourself from natural disasters. And, we used to just think that was certain regions of the country, but I think everybody has just about some kind of natural disaster risk these days. And renters, they're not immune either. We've seen property managers and landlords raise the rents hundreds, thousands of dollars with little to no warning and no remorse. Now, we can't predict the future, but we can play out some of these scenarios in our head, and it's better to think about them now while we're in positions to adapt to them. The fourth point I wanted to cover is just other overlooked expenses that we may not think about, but they all occur as we age and during retirement. And one of those is replacing our car. We know cars have a lifespan, and at some point we're going to have to replace it, either through age or accident. Cars are very expensive, and they're expensive to maintain and insure. So when we go into retirement, we need to have enough money set aside that's liquid and accessible to replace that car if needed, especially if you are dependent upon that kind of transportation. Next is long-term care. I'm talking about assisted living, senior care, memory care, nursing homes. One thing they all have in common is they cost a small fortune every month. And I know as Gen Xers, we don't want to think about any of that. I don't want to think about it. Hopefully that doesn't happen. And hopefully if it does happen, it's many, many, many decades away. There are products out there now that try to address this problem, long-term care insurance, but it's rife with problems. The premiums are really expensive and they increase as you age. A lot of long-term care insurance companies, they've gone belly up and they leave you uninsured at a time when you may not be able to get coverage again. Also, what about dental care in retirement? We know how expensive dental care is now, and Medicare doesn't cover it at all. A couple of implants and you're way over 10 grand at this point. A crown will cost you around $1,200, $1,500. That's a lot of money when you're no longer working and you're depending upon Social Security or your nest egg. And then there are the home emergencies. They surely don't stop once you retire. The new roof, the frozen pipes, the flooded basement, a tree that fell on the house. And you think, well, I'll just use my homeowner's insurance. And we know that if we make a huge claim on our insurance, we risk getting canceled or non-renewed. That's what we pay the insurance premiums for. And yet when we need them, where are they? All of these are expenses that can derail a retirement. And I don't think we can ever truly be certain that we can afford retirement. Some of us, you have a multi-million-dollar nest egg, you're probably good. But for everyone else, we just have to retire anyway. We've lived long enough to know there are no certainties in life, except of course the old standbys, death and taxes. So how do we improve our odds? And outside of just saving millions of dollars, how do we get the retirement that we've hoped for? You have to start now. You can run those retirement calculators, and put in all the what-if scenarios that you can. You have to account for, inflation, of course, but what if it stays really high for a long period of time? What if you and your spouse, you live well into your 90s? It's better to wrestle with all these possibilities now while we still have options to address them. Next, you can consider delaying retirement by a few years. Those extra years of income, they can go a long way, padding your savings, giving your money a little longer time to grow. Another option is to delay taking Social Security until age 70, because that gives you a bigger Social Security check, and it's a check that you can't outlive. You could also think about working part-time. I know I mentioned this in a previous video that if you can just bring in a little over $300 a month, working part-time. That's just over $4,000 a year. That is equivalent to an extra $100,000 in your retirement nest egg. That's huge. And finally, we have to consider alternative retirement lifestyles such as tiny homes or co-housing, multi-generational living. These aren't really fringe ideas anymore. The way things are progressing, they're going to become more and more mainstream, whether we like it or not. And in some ways, we've seen this coming. You know, as kids, we saw the one-income household go away. Today, side gigs are almost necessary in order to make ends meet. It seems that the more we work, the more the middle class shrinks and the more poverty rises. So it's time for us as Gen Xers today to get clear-eyed about what retirement could look like for us. We may have to fight a lot harder than we thought in order to have it. Now, I know I've painted a pretty tough picture today in this video, but I don't want that to stop us. I don't want that to defeat us. What I want it to do is to get us engaged, get us empowered, help us to think and plan now before it's too late. If this video opened your eyes a little bit, then check out this playlist. I'll link it right here. The Retirement Realities for Gen X. It's not all about doom and gloom. I try to explore every option available to us because I believe that we still have a lot of good years ahead of us and we can still accomplish so much and turn around any situation. Now, if you found this video, this channel, that it speaks to you, I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of this community. Help me be a voice that speaks for our generation. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great week. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.